Welcome to the Octopod. I'm Kyle Davis, head of the Office of the CTO. Join us as we dive into the latest technologies and trends shaping business. Whether you're a tech enthusiast, a business leader, or just looking to stay ahead in the digital age, this podcast is for you. Let's unlock opportunities with technology together. Let's jump in. So this time we're going to delve into our topic of Beyond 2024 Cybersecurity Decoded. And today I'm joined by Rich and Harps from Rubrik. Guys, would you like to introduce yourself for everyone?
Hi, so my name's Harpinder, or Harps for short. I'm the lead channel SE for Rubrik in the UK.
Hello, I'm Richard Cassidy. I'm field CISO for EMEA for Rubrik.
Excellent, thank guys. So today we're going to break this session into three parts. The first of them talking about the evolution of threats and how we're seeing the change of attackers in today's world. The second part, we're going to delve into some of the data out of the Rubrik Zero Labs report and what that tells us about them threats. And then thirdly, we're going to focus on how can we evolve the way we protect our organizations to counter the changing actors out there. So let's get into it. So welcome everyone to part one. Here we're going to talk about the changing themes within the threat landscape. Why are things different than they've been in the past? And that can lead us then to, why do we need to change the way that we think about protecting our organizations? We're going to focus on three core themes for this part of the conversation. The first one is, what's that change in activity? What are threat actors doing and why is that important? The second piece is going to be that impact of Gen AI. And the third piece is, why is resilience, actually that ability to withstand attacks in the first place, so important today as we look at things like exfiltration and extortion, etc. So Harps, from your perspective, what are you seeing as them big changes in the activity within inside the data center and inside the customer's environments?
So we're seeing a lot of changes. When I joined Rubrik, I think the first 6 months or so, I was talking around encryption of data, bad actors being in your environment for many months. But that conversation is now changing from months to days. So the average median dwell time internationally now is 9 days for an attacker to get in and move laterally and get into a position of comfort where they've got a bit of a hold in an environment. So we're no longer talking about months anymore. We're now coming down to days. So that's a big change for an organization. So everyone needs to be aware of that. Rich, what would you say the reasons are for this, for getting in a lot sooner, a little faster?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. The industry's always been hyper-focused on how are the attackers doing what they're doing. Are they becoming more sophisticated? What are the tools that they're operating with? I think we've got to take it back, at least in my experience, to a more simplistic view, right? Have attackers traditionally changed the way they attack, or the modus operandi, or the operational tactics? And the answer is no, right? They still follow a very similar process, similar to the Lockheed Martin kill chain, right, which we all know about. And there's other variants which MITRE have come up with. So they still follow the same process, right? Know thy target, gather information on who you're going to attack, then go through a process of understanding what are the defense points you have to infiltrate, and then build code around that. Now, that's where things have changed. How do I build the code? How do I create the campaigns, malware, whatever it is that I want to use to break in? And one of the things we've all heard about is attackers aren't breaking it anymore, they're logging it. And credentials have always remained key in any adversary's arsenal of attack. And so it's automation and gaining that level of detail that's changed. And some of it's down to AI, of course it is, but it's all down to automation and scripting, good old Python programming, really, if you think about it.
Do you think that because organizations are becoming more hybrid cloud, utilization of SaaS platforms and cloud, is that basically meaning that there's more access points for an attacker, potentially?
Yeah, there's no doubt that businesses have adopted cloud at a significant rate, and there's all sorts of figures in the marketplace to back that up. So the footprint of organizations has grown significantly, and therefore, yes, there's a larger market, if you like, or a state for the attackers to go after, but they're doing it with much more ease now, right? And we saw only last year the first piece of concept code around Gen AI toolsets that were allowing a relatively unsophisticated attacker just to ask conversational AI to create a piece of code that would run a phishing attack and then drop some malware, right? And it did it from start to finish, wrote the code, and the code was executed. And so what we're seeing now is that automation, larger estate to attack, and using tools that allow them to attack more targets more quickly.
I think that concept of ransomware as a service, it used to be this highly technical requirement, and therefore the scope of who could do it was narrow to those that could build that mini empire almost. But now you take disgruntled employee X that's been laid off for the wrong reason, who Googles the dark web, and then from there finds the next site and the next site. Next minute, it's a simple credit card transaction, and they've initiated an attack on their old boss that they didn't like. And that's a scary position to be in a world of AI and etc.
Yeah, I always like to keep an eye on the dark web, right? It's actually very easy to gain access. I'm not going to tell you how on this podcast, but YouTube it and you'll find out how to do it. And it's actually not a bad thing to do as long as you're not transacting, to keep an eye on what's out there. Ransomware as a service is the easiest thing to find when you load up the dark web browsers. And only last week was I at a site within a couple of minutes of searching that said, who would you like to write a ransomware attack against? Give us the company name. And they would come back with a quote, and it would be anywhere between $20 to $5,000 for the campaign. And if you give them a name of a business that they will successfully breach and encrypt and extort from, you could take a percentage of the earnings. So it really is a service that you can make a living of. Not that I would ever want anybody to do that, but that's just what we're up against. It's the ease of being able to use these tool sets.
But I think that's where that credentials theft and identity management is so important, but also not just from an external perspective, but thinking about them internal roles and that lateral movement capability, because you just don't know what the personal state of any employee is and where they're driven to support their family or their habits or whatever it happens to be. And if they can make money, people will make money, and they're not necessarily as ethical as we might be sometimes, unfortunately.
Yeah, as you mentioned around credential theft, it's a good point, because that's basically their access into an environment, and we're seeing different waves of attack just in credential theft. So whether it's picking up a telephone, ringing up a help desk and resetting a username and password, which is what happened at the MGM Grand in Vegas, all the way down to physical violence, which is when we're seeing that now as well in terms of credential thefts. So, they just need those credentials to be able to get in. They're also now, we're seeing some attacks against, for example, if you've got a gym membership, is the chances are you'll probably be using similar passwords at your gym membership as you would at work. So this is another attack vector that we're seeing as well.
Not necessarily the same levels of sophistication protecting that gym account as maybe protecting your corporate data from that side of stuff.
Yeah, and look, there's no doubt that credentials are key. We said that earlier on. But let's not forget the multitude of vendor-related breaches we've seen in 2023 alone, right? And I don't want to upset anybody, so I won't name vendors particularly, but Google search and you'll see. But one really recent example was the Akira ransomware group in Northern Europe, in Finland. They were able to drop their malware, their ransomware, into organizations using vulnerabilities in Cisco ASA devices, only because, and they would only be organizations that didn't have multi-factor authentication enabled for those devices, which begs another question, which I'm sure we'll talk about in a minute. And so we have to also understand that whilst we may do everything we can possibly do within the confines of technology to protect us from these breach vectors, there's always going to be zero-day threats. There's always going to be vulnerabilities in code that we really can't predict. And we need to have a capability, which we'll talk about later, which gives us a recovery, a get out of jail, whatever you want to call it, capability, so that business operations can continue.
It's a good point, because we see 61% of the attacks are leveraging known vulnerabilities. So if we know about these vulnerabilities, there must be a reason why we're not actually doing anything about it proactively. We shouldn't be waiting for us to be hit before we actually start closing those doors. So it's something that we need to be careful.
100%. I think when we get to that resilience part of the conversation later in this section, I think that's going to be a really core piece. Why are 62% of known vulnerabilities still a problem? And that's a fundamental piece. But Harps, you were talking earlier offline about this sort of changing vector of attacks to not necessarily coming in at, from guest OS down, but actually coming from hypervisor up almost, and the impact that has on a lot of sort of traditional technologies.
Yeah. So we're seeing a lot of attacks now attacking virtual machines. So utilizing the host to then start encrypting the virtual machines. Now, if you think about, what the impact of this is is if an attacker gets access to a host, the virtual machines on there, if they encrypt those, then they're basically going to be bypassed. So if, for example, you've got your backup software running as a virtual machine, there's no point in having immutable backups if you can't log into the software to do anything about it. If you've got EDR or front-facing scanning devices running as virtual machines, again, they'll be bypassed, so you won't be getting alerts from these. Now, when I was working in a bank about 15 years ago, ESX hosts, we had about 30 to 50 virtual machines running on a host. But now we saw an attack only about 6 months ago in Germany where there was about 500 virtual machines in an education institution, all encrypted. And if you think about the power of that, that's a completely different wave of an attack, because a lot of the softwares out there at the moment are monitoring file level encryption. And whereas this is going up a level, it's kind of like the Russian doll syndrome. Everyone's looking at the smallest doll, they just go up one level. And
just evolving that attack process all the time. Yeah. And Rich, do you see that driving the development of the ransomware? Because traditionally it's been a very Windows focused world, but that's because most devices are running Windows. So why wouldn't you focus yourself on the largest pool of potential threats? But ESXi is not based on Windows. So are you seeing that evolution driven by the sort of stuff that Harps is talking about?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, because is there honor amongst thieves, right? Have there been traditionally less attacks on Linux-based systems because Linux is more open source and the attackers are an open source bunch, right, by nature? I wish that were true. We live in a world of hope, but I think the reality is more down to the ease of attacking Windows systems has been traditionally just the way to go. Cyber criminals are all of that low-hanging fruit, biggest bang for their euro, buck, whatever the currency is you transact in, with the lowest possible effort. But interesting, to answer your question directly, Checkpoint Research Labs again and other sources have found that last year there's been a noted increase in Linux-based ransomware tool sets. So you've got the likes of Clop, Icefire, Black Cat, and others writing more Linux-based ransomware tools with a specific interest, as Harps mentioned, in ESXi, for the very reason that why go after multiple servers in ESXi hosts as guest OSs, when if you can take the host out, then you've got every single guest OS that sits there. Easy to do, biggest bang for your buck again, and creates a lot of turmoil in an organization trying to recover from it.
But it's a lot of speaks to that evolution of the attacks. As we put more and more defense in at the guest OS level, they just change tact and come in at a different angle. And if you haven't got your operational business processes right, your network segmentation right, then potentially them hosts are more vulnerable than the guest OSs in a lot of environments.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. One of the benefits of my job is getting to sit with CISOs of various organizations. I think if I look at, since I joined Rubrik last year, and I combine all the questions I've ever had, or the objections to whether resilience is a key project, almost all of them have said, well, my EDR project is more important, or my increasing in analytics behavior and tool sets and detection methodologies. But, EDR, several bypass capabilities last year alone, UBA, it's been around for the past decade and a bit. I mean, I used to sell analytics capabilities with multiple vendors, and even those organizations were breached. So it still tells the buyer, right, whoever's making the decisions in the organization, that the traditional approach isn't the best approach, and we've got to do things differently.
Yeah, and it's great that you say that, because a lot of our thoughts into the market is actually that resilience conversation has to be about how you withstand the attack as much as how you actually survive it at the end. So we use this visualize, withstand, survive methodology. So understand your organization, understand all your applications, your data, your people, your processes. Ensure that withstand piece isn't just your traditional security tooling, but how do you do basic IT operations correctly, patch things, update hardware, all these standard change control, coding processes. What was it? Was it Barclays last year where the developer downloaded something from GitHub and chucked it into a payment cart somewhere and it had some ransomware embedded in it? That's a basic development process that failed there. That's not something that should have happened from that side of it. So we have to evolve that thinking, and I think resilience has to become the big conversation, and it can't just be do a backup.
Yeah, which leads into the next part, I think, really is around there's one thing to have cyber recovery and another thing to have cyber resilience. They're totally different things, because from a cyber recovery perspective, we're basically talking about encryption attacks and being able to recover your data back to a last known good state. Now, if we start talking about resilience, then we're talking about things like theft and extortion, which is on the rise, what we call data exfiltration, which is essentially the bad actors getting into your environment and sometimes not even encrypting anything because they don't need to. They're just going to come in and they're going to just try and steal some data. Now, if you think about this, if they're using credentials, it's not anomalous behavior for somebody to use a username and password of an employee. So it's not going to be flagged up on your systems that's anomalous. What we are seeing is things like elevation of privileges on the increase, so that they can get a normal user and turn them into an admin user and have more access to sensitive data, with the goal of just exfiltrating data. Because once data's left your organization, there's no undoing of that. There's no recovery from that.
So I'm saying the backup isn't going to help you at that point if all their goal was to extort you. And we were talking to Paolo actually a few weeks ago, and they said they're seeing this rise of actually extortion of family members, of board members. And it's like, imagine the CEO getting a call from his wife saying, we've had a call from ransomware group X and they've told me we know where your kids are. I mean, that's going to change your mindset on whether you pay that ransom or not completely.
Absolutely.
But it also drives into a lot of the regulatory pieces that are coming in, DORA, NIS2, etc., that are forcing organisations to now actually be able to prove their processes and that. But it is interesting of why we need these regulations to force people to do stuff that really they should be doing anyway.
Yeah, it's a good point. And if I look at, again, going beyond Rubrik, 22 years plus in industry now, I know I look that old. It wasn't kind to me, but you can't see that for the podcast listeners. But the interesting thing is, a lot of cybersecurity, data security spend has been largely aligned to what frameworks and legislation have demanded that the organizations do. And that's not a bad thing, because there's been a real need to learn a lot of data very quickly. And the cybersecurity industry moves probably one of the quickest in terms of things to learn and know. I mean, every day's different, right? So CISOs, CIOs, they've had to make decisions based upon that. Legislation is different, because if you don't meet legislation, you get fined, and that's not great for the business. The shareholders get very upset with that. But frameworks is where it's interesting for me, because I have seen a lot of organizations, not all, with respect to those that are listening to this that I've dealt with in the past 20 odd years, just say, okay, well, let's adopt a NIST framework. Let's look at the NCSE CAF framework. Let's look at some SANS frameworks, whatever it is. There's so many out there to choose from, and try to retrofit something to a business process that it maybe isn't really well designed for. And, Sun Tzu's art of all, right? Know thy enemy. I think if any CISO, CIO looked at the business that they operate, looked at the markets that they transact with, and the types of consumers they're interacting with, if you do interact with consumers, because it may not be B2C, it could be B2B, who would attack your data and what would they be doing? And there's a wealth of information out there today on that. We only have to look at the MITRE ATT&CK framework or the APT group information. There's so many research companies that attribute what UNC attack groups do, etc. So we will know what they do and use an organization leader for making responsible decisions on cybersecurity spend and data security spend. Have a blueprint of what your likely attacker profile looks like. And then you can map that back to your technological capabilities. I don't know why you wouldn't do that personally. It's one of the first things I would ever want to see a CISO do, is understand who they're up against and then look at their cybersecurity, data security strategy and say, does it stand up? And if it doesn't, fix it.
It begs that question as well in terms of who's responsible in the event of a cyber attack for a data breaches, whether it is a CISO, whether it's a CEO, for example. Now, I think I've had some discussions over the past few weeks where it is starting to go up to the CEO level, as in terms of, instead of the CIO, it's actually the CEO is now responsible for data.
I think it's important though that we educate people that it isn't security isn't a outcome of the security team. They're there to monitor it and govern it, but actually it's a business-wide outcome that we've got to think about here. It can't just be this one team is going to fix this problem, because if HR then decide to do some wacky process or finance do something over here, then that's going to be a source of your breach. And if they don't tell the security team, they can't advise, they can't help on that. So we've got to look at it far more holistically than just, the security team are going to hold all the keys and solve all the problems.
Yeah, I mean, we only have to look to the story of the Uber CISO as to just how dark life can become when, and I'm not saying that Uber got it wrong. There were certainly some lapses of judgment, but largely what happened there is a story that we would hear across most businesses. And if you look at previous legislation and frameworks, they've been very, woolly is not the word, but ambiguous is probably a better term to use, on who would be responsible in the event of a failure of a particular alignment to legislation. And a lot of board members and C-level suite probably hide behind, in the UK specifically, the limited company. Well, it's the company's issue. So if it all goes horribly wrong, the company's liable. That's the whole point of having a company. But DORA is changing the game there, right? And we're going to see that also become very relevant to the UK this year. Is DORA will hold C-level suite to task, right? You can do custodial sentences now as a CEOs, board members. It's very specific on who's responsible. So you can no longer hide behind ambiguity in legislation. You will be responsible as C-level.
No worries. No, that's been great. I mean, hopefully that gives everyone a bit of a view of how complex this changing landscape is. There isn't just one thread to this. There's multiple threads. And I think the takeaway here is you've got to understand who it is that's likely to be attacking you, how these threats are changing, so you can put your efforts into the right places to actually help you evolve that. And we'll talk a bit more about that evolution piece going forward. So thank you both, and we'll see you in the next session. Thanks for listening, everyone. I've been Rob Sims, Chief Technologist from CDW.
I've been Harpinder Singh Powar, Lead Channel SE for Rubrik in the UK.
I've been Richie Cassidy, Field CISO for EMEA at Rubrik.
Thanks for tuning in to today's episode. Be sure to check out the back catalogue for more great insights. Don't forget to subscribe via your favourite podcast platform so you never miss an episode. We appreciate your support. And if you have a topic you want us to cover, feel free to reach out. Catch you next time.